All right, so first of all, thank you very much, Professor Carmel, for inviting me to speak in this forum. I'd like to take a couple of administrative issues off the table first. I'd like to tell everybody that I'm not one of the founders of ICQ. They're younger and smarter than I am, so that's one thing. The other thing is that if you look at the title of my presentation, it says, "Looking for the Exit, Let the Israeli High-Tech Industry Live Up to Its Potential." It may imply the wrong message, because what I'm going to talk to you about is that the fact this exit culture that we have is actually standing in our way to implement our full potential as a full high-tech potential. And this is the subject of my discussion. Let's start talking about that. Let's start with the life cycle of an Israeli startup. I don't think it's any special than any unique in comparison to other startups around the world, but it starts with a brilliant idea by a young or an old Israeli entrepreneur with a talent and a dream. He can't do anything without money, so you usually go to investors. In Israel, it's typically the venture capital funds or private investors that expect to get a very high return on their investment and a very quick return on their investment. Once you have the money in place, then you start doing the development. You start working on your development, you develop a product, and you're focusing on developing a product because this is what the startup is about. It's a product, mainly. And then, if you're lucky, and as we know, not all the startups are that lucky. I think 1 out of 15, 1 out of 20, 1 out of 10, if somebody has the statistics, actually makes an exit. Is either being acquired by a large company or goes to a public offering. And when it's being acquired by a large company, it's usually an American company, not always, but it's usually an American company or a global company. Now here comes the interesting part. Once a startup is acquired by the large company, which is most of the cases, or most of the exits, quote unquote, then what typically happens, the company swallows the startup into its own lines. Management of the startup business is done usually out of the headquarters of that buying company. And at best, we are remained with a development center, an R&D center in Israel. That's usually the typical case. It has happened in most of the startups that we're all familiar with. ICQ was one of them. We'll talk about that later. But again, the point is that Israel is remained with an R&D center. Management goes into the US. And by management, I'm not just talking about the CEO. I'm talking about marketing, I'm talking about sales, and many times I'm also talking about operations. And after some times when the founder, or usually the founder, spending some time within the buying company, they move on to the next startup, and we know, and we have many examples of founders that have done this cycle more than once. Now here's the conflict. Everybody wants to make the killing early. The venture capital funds want to make the killing early. This is their commitment to their investments, and so do the founders. You know, they're working with very low wages. They're very capable, gifted people, and they're working with very low wages because cash they're cash constrained. And you really cannot be in a situation where you tell them don't sell your company. Okay, this is the nature of the business. The venture capital wants to sell a company, and so do the founders. Now, the other thing is the company is positioned to be sold at an early stage. So it's usually working on a feature, on the product. It's not always working on the whole picture of being able to sell it, to market it, to operate a mass production line, and so on and so forth. So we essentially end up with the situation where we're very good at technology, and we're not good enough in operations, we're not good enough in marketing, and we're not good enough in sales, and we're not good enough in business strategy. And everybody considers Israel as a technology place. Believe me, I see this day in, day out. When I go to AOL, they talk about Israel as a technology place. You know, there was a Google convention in Israel about 6 months ago, and one of the VPs of Google, one of the founders, not one of the two founders, but a lady, 32, 33 years old, came over and there was this big convention, and there was this journalist from the Globes that was facilitating the convention, and his first question to her was, what do you think of the Israeli engineers? Come on, it's time that we move forward. It's time that we stop thinking about ourselves as engineers. You know, we were very good engineers 20 years ago. It's time to think about something else. And this exit strategy, this exit culture that we have, that is so strongly embedded in everything that we do in high technology in Israel, is preventing us from going to the next step. Let me give you some statistics. High tech, based on my sources, is 50% of Israeli exports. There are 3,000 Israeli startup companies, high-tech companies, but with very few with revenue exceeding $50 million. A revenue of $50 million in America is what? A small company? A medium-sized company? We have, I don't know, 10 companies like that, or 15 companies, or 20 companies like that, but by no comparison to the 3,000 high-tech companies. Now, there are good reasons for that. First of all, we don't have a local market. It's not that easy to sell technology into the Israeli market, but that shouldn't be a problem because all American companies sell technologies outside of America as well. But we also do not have the kind of management that goes beyond the technology management, that goes beyond the R&D management, that can grow a company to be successful. That's in the high technology. Yesterday we heard an example of non-high technology, although I'm sure there's so much technology in the Strauss business, but it's not a high-tech business.
We call it food tech.
Food tech. There you go. And we just don't have that. We don't develop enough of it, and that's a very sad thing as far as I'm concerned. And what I would like to propose, and I'm by no means the expert on making that kind of proposition. There are experts that can probably work on this and do something else or come up with a better solution than I came up with. I'd like to suggest that as the Israeli government essentially made the venture capital business by selling technology greenhouse to the venture capital funds, that did not happen before the Israeli government actually did that. I think the Israeli government should probably do something about encouraging either global companies or global American companies that buy businesses in Israel to keep the headquarters, to keep the management in Israel, or by tax benefits, or by grants, or even encourage private equity funds to buy those companies and to keep them in Israel. Because you cannot really tell the VCs or the founders not to sell the company. That's not a legitimate argument. But you can encourage people that buy the company to keep the business in Israel, not just the R&D. And Israel needs these kind of people, okay? And everywhere, not just in technology, in the government, strong operation people would do wonders in our government, okay? I'm not talking ministers, I'm talking in key positions. These are the kind of things that we're lacking, and we're not doing much or enough to grow these kind of skills within Israel.